inviting me to speak to you today. I applaud Orthodox Christian laity for recognizing the need for informed discussion on the issue of Orthodox self-governance, which has recently become a much debated topic in the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese specifically, and the American Orthodox churches more generally. By the way, those of you who would like to do further reading on this issue, I recommend 3 works in particular. There's an article by Dr. Louis Patsavos, who is a canon law professor at Hellenic College and Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology, called The Primacy of the See of Constantinople in Theory and Practice. It's in a small book called Primacy and Conciliarity. There is actually a very good article on the Boethia website by a Russian canonist and theologian named Sergius Troitsky. It's called The Limits of Authority of the Constantinopolitan Patriarchate over the Diaspora. And finally, probably the best and most complete work, I believe, is by John Erickson, who is the professor of canon law at St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary. He has an article from the St. Vladimir's Theological Quarterly called Autocephaly in Orthodox Canonical Literature to the 13th Century. It has been expanded and is called The Autocephalous Church. It's chapter 7 of his book, and I've forgotten now the name of the book. Something about tradition. I'm sorry, I can't remember the exact title now, but it's the only book he has, I think, so you shouldn't have trouble finding it. It's published by St. Vladimir Seminary Press. I believe that we first need to articulate what Orthodox self-governance means. In other words, what is it? Then, by reviewing the Church's history and some relevant canons, we can broach the more complicated issue of what we may call the rules, unquote, of self-governance. Who decides when a church may become self-governing? How is it decided, and on what basis? What we shall see is that, unfortunately, there are no clear-cut answers to these questions. But let's begin with some definitions. As I just mentioned earlier, the first question we must answer is, what is Orthodox self-governance? In the modern Orthodox world, we recognize 2 forms of self-governance, autonomy and autocephaly. Autocephaly is the term we are more familiar with. It refers to a church which is completely self-governing, in other words, which manages its own affairs and which elects and ordains its own bishops. Some examples of autocephalous churches are the ancient patriarchates, such as Constantinople and Antioch, more recent patriarchates, such as Russia and Serbia, and autocephalous churches with an archbishop or metropolitan as head, such as Cyprus, Greece, and Albania. Autonomous churches, such as Finland and Japan, are almost completely self-governing, but the head of their church is usually elected by the Mother Church's synod rather than by the synod of bishops of the autonomous church itself. In almost all other respects, however, autonomous churches are as independent and self-governing as autocephalous churches. The ecclesiology of self-governance is as old as Christianity itself. As Christianity spread to different cities in the Roman Empire, a new church was created in each city, a church headed by a bishop who was surrounded by a college of presbyters, or priests, and deacons. The bishops, particularly in the large and important cities of the empire, were usually elected either with the approval of an apostle or in part because he had been the disciple of one of the apostles. Thus, the early bishops maintained the apostolic tradition, that is, the beliefs and practices of the apostolic church, through this apostolic succession. Each of these churches was self-governing in its affairs, but at the same time connected to sister churches through recognition of the orthodoxy, in other words, the right belief and practice of these neighboring churches. For important issues beyond the local level, the bishops of all the cities in a region or province would gather in council, led by the bishop of the most important city in the province. This bishop became known as metropolitan. Later, the heads of some self-governing churches were called archbishop, particularly if there were no suffragan bishops under the authority of the archbishop. Thus, the conciliar authority of the larger church balanced the independence of the local church. This is articulated in Canon 34 of the so-called Apostolic Canons, which admonishes the local bishop to, quote, do only whatever is necessitated by his own parish and by the territories under him, unquote, and, quote, to refrain from doing anything superfluous without his metropolitan's advice and approval, unquote, while at the same time warning the metropolitan not to, quote, do anything without the advice and consent and approval of all, unquote. By the way, this canon was quoted in the past few months, first by Archbishop Spiridon against the metropolitans of the American Synod, and then by the metropolitans themselves against the archbishops. Now, let us examine a few relevant instances from Orthodoxy's early historical and canonical record. The highest level of self-governance became the criterion for determining what we now call a patriarchate. This means that the head of the church was elected by that church's own highest synod and ordained by bishops of the same synod. This head also had some oversight over regional synods and local bishops at lower levels. In the earliest centuries of the church's existence, there were 2 or perhaps 3 patriarchates, Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch, which corresponded to the empire's most important cities in Europe, Africa, and Asia, respectively. Their preeminence was recognized in Canon 6 of the First Ecumenical Council, which was held in Nicaea in 325 AD. Canon 6, although it does not use the word patriarchate, in fact that word would not be used until much later, explicitly grants wide direct authority to the bishops of Alexandria and Rome over the churches in their regions, and commands that seniority be preserved for Antioch in its province. The churches of Asia, Pontus, and Thrace each appear to be self-governing according to this canon. Constantinople at this time was under the Metropolitan of Heraclea of the Diocese of Thrace, and Jerusalem was granted a place of honor by Canon 7 of the same council. Until then, it was under the Metropolitanate of Palestinian Caesarea. The 2 sees were not recognized as patriarchates with any regional authority until later at the Fourth Ecumenical Council. Unfortunately, problems began arising almost as soon as Christianity became a legal religion of the Roman Empire. Therefore, at the Second Ecumenical Council, held in 381 in Constantinople, the bishops found it necessary to enact Canon 2, which forbade individual bishops from, quote, carrying out an ordination or any other ecclesiastical services, unquote, outside their province unless specifically invited. The canon also forbade synods of bishops from administering or otherwise exercising authority over churches beyond the borders of their own diocese. Now, it is important to understand that the word diocese originally referred to a civil administrative unit, similar in size to a modern-day state or country. The aim of the canon, in other words, is to require local or regional self-determination for churches in all parts of the empire. What is to happen outside the empire is a bit more vague, since the canon simply states that those churches, quote, must be administered in accordance with the customary practice of the fathers, unquote. So, what was that practice? In general, churches who sent out missionaries had authority over the churches which they created in these foreign, non-Christian lands. Obviously, this canon gives no special authority to Constantinople, although Canon 3 of the same Ecumenical Council does refer specifically to Constantinople and states in full, let the Bishop of Constantinople, however, have the priorities of honor, in Greek, presbyia timis, after the Bishop of Rome, because of its, that is Constantinople's, being New Rome. Constantinople thus displaced Alexandria in rank in the east. Its increased prestige was a natural consequence of its increased political power. But what does this canon mean substantively? Perhaps not very much. However, the Fourth Ecumenical Council, held in Chalcedon in 451, in Canons 9 and 17 explicitly granted to Constantinople powers such as hearing appeals, although in fact Constantinople had already been taking appeals for a couple of centuries. But most important for our discussion is the 28th canon from this council, in which the bishops state that, quote, we too decree and vote the same things in regard to the privileges and priorities of the Most Holy Church of that same Constantinople and New Rome, unquote. In other words, the same things as Canon 2 of the Second Ecumenical Council. The canon goes on to explicate what this means. That the metropolitans of the formerly autocephalous Pontic, Asian, and Thracian dioceses shall now be ordained by the Archbishop of Constantinople, as well as, quote, the bishops of the aforesaid dioceses who are among the barbarians, unquote, are to be ordained by him. This 28th canon from Chalcedon has been used in this century to justify universal jurisdiction by the ecumenical patriarch over all lands not previously assigned specifically to another patriarchate. According to the Russian canonist Sergius Troitsky, this interpretation began only in 1922 with Patriarch Meletios Metaxakis. The problem with such an interpretation is that it ignores three important elements of the canon. First, the canon gives the ecumenical patriarch the right of ordination only over the bishops in, quote, barbarian lands, unquote, which are under the authority of the churches of Pontus, Asia, and Thrace. Secondly, Constantinople's right of ordination is limited to the metropolitans of Pontus, Asia, and Thrace, and to the bishops in the barbarian lands under the control of these three churches. The canon specifically states that each metropolitan, together with other bishops of his province, shall ordain provincial bishops. Thirdly, the Archbishop of Constantinople is given only the right of ordination. Neither he nor his synod is given the right to elect any bishops in these three dioceses. In fact, the last sentence of the canon explicitly states that the patriarch is to ordain these bishops, quote, after the elections have first been conducted in accordance with custom and have been reported to him, unquote. These limitations on excessive, much less universal, authority and jurisdiction are consonant with Canon 8 of the Third Ecumenical Council, held in Ephesus 20 years earlier in 431. That canon stopped the encroachment of the Bishop of Antioch on the self-governing authority of the Church of Cyprus, describing such encroachment as, quote, an innovation, a thing which is contrary to the ecclesiastical laws and the canons of the holy apostles, and one which touches the freedom of all, unquote. While Canon 8 specifically confirms a pre-existing autocephaly for the Church of Cyprus by reasserting its right to ordain its own bishops, the canon also proclaims that, quote, the same rule shall hold good also with regard to the other dioceses and churches everywhere, so that none of the bishops most beloved by God shall take hold of any other province that was not formally and from the beginning in his jurisdiction, or was not, that is to say, held by his predecessors, unquote. Thus, Canon 28 of Chalcedon was not an expansion of the ecumenical patriarchate's jurisdiction, but rather a way of showing that his limited authority in ordaining the metropolitans of Pontus, Asia, and Thrace was not a violation of Canon 8 of Ephesus, but rather a rearticulation of the honors bestowed upon him 50 years earlier by Canon 3 of Constantinople. In sum, there are really no specific rules or canons governing autocephaly per se. Canon 8 of the Third Ecumenical Council is the only instance of an ecumenical council explicitly confirming a church's autocephaly, which the Council Fathers understood as the standard model. For the early church, you see, autocephaly was the norm. Patriarchs or synods were not supposed to exercise authority over churches not within their imperial administrative area, the original meaning of diocese, if you'll recall. And, except for Rome and Alexandria, they were not supposed to exercise direct control even over the metropolitan synods in their region. It was only when bishops began claiming jurisdiction and authority over regions not traditionally under their control that the universal church had to intervene to protect the self-governance of a local or regional church, as in the case of Cyprus. The contracting of the size of the empire, coupled with the conversion of the Slavs to Christianity, Russia, Bulgaria, and Serbia all became Christian in the 9th century, therefore presented the Eastern Church with a new situation. Never before had whole nations become Christian whose territories were outside the boundaries of the empire. Initially, Constantinople, or Rome in the case of the Moravians, closely supervised these daughter churches. As the churches became more mature, however, and as Constantinople became weaker politically and militarily, the mother church lessened her immediate control over her daughters. The Church of Georgia was fully autocephalous by the 8th century. And ethnically Bulgarian Ohrid, in the modern-day former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, was autocephalous from the beginning of the 10th century, and occasionally was recognized as a patriarchate. In the case of the Church of Kiev in Russia, a type of autonomy or near autocephaly was embodied in a unique practice. From 1240 until 1448, Russians and Greeks alternated as metropolitans of Kiev, appointed by the Kievan and Constantinopolitan churches respectively. In other words, what developed was a variation on the system which today we call autonomy. In 1441, the Metropolitanate of Kiev ousted its Greek metropolitan, Isidore, who had filled the see for only 5 months before leaving for the Council of Ferrara, Florence, where he signed and strongly supported the union agreement with the Church of Rome. Isidore fled to Italy and became a cardinal in the Roman Church. The Church of Kiev, after receiving no communication from Constantinople, which was on the verge of collapse, in 1448 elected Jonas of Ryazan, the Russians' original choice for metropolitan. Jonas's election was the de facto beginning of the Russian Church's autocephaly. The Russians' dismay with Constantinople's capitulation to unionism only solidified their commitment to autocephaly. The Metropolitanate soon moved to Moscow after Tatar control over that city ended. It took many decades, though, before Constantinople formally recognized Russia's autocephaly. And in 1593, Constantinople recognized the elevation of the See of Moscow to patriarchal status. The Serbian Church has a similarly erratic and complex history. In the late 12th century, Rostko, the son of Stefan Nemanja, or Nemanja, prince and leader of the Serbian people, became a monk under the name of Sava. His father, taking the name of Simeon, soon followed him into monasticism, and the two founded the monastery of Hilandari on Mount Athos. After St. Simeon's death in 1207, St. Sava returned to Serbia, where in 1219, the Nicene Patriarch, because the Latins had control of Constantinople at this time, the Nicene Patriarch made him its autocephalous archbishop, over the protests of the autocephalous Archbishop of Ohrid, who saw his archdiocese carved up for the new Serbian see. This archbishopric was totally independent of Constantinople, or Nicaea, and encompassed some territory not under the ecclesiastical control of Constantinople, or the political control of Serbia. The Serbian archbishop's only subordination to Constantinople was a requirement simply to mention the patriarch first in the diptychs. That's the commemoration of other bishops, beginning with one's own metropolitan or patriarch. In other words, the Serbian church was autonomous and virtually autocephalous. In 1253, the see was transferred from Žica to Peć. In 1345, the Serbian king Stephen Dušan elevated the archbishopric to a patriarchate, an action which was denounced by the ecumenical patriarch, but recognized by the Greek archbishop of Ohrid, the Bulgarian patriarch of Trnovo, whose own archiepiscopal see had also been carved out of Ohrid, and the monasteries of Mount Athos. Constantinople's anathema of the Serbian church lasted until 1371, when Patriarch Philotheos, a former Athonite, concelebrated with the Serbian clergy in Peć and formally recognized Sava IV as Serbian patriarch. As the political situations changed, however, so did the self-governing status of provincial synods and some of these autocephalous or autonomous churches. Constantinople gained increasing power over its suffragan sees throughout the Byzantine period, including usurping the right to elect provincial bishops. And under Ottoman rule, all Orthodox churches within the Ottoman Empire, including even other patriarchates, were subordinated to the Patriarch of Constantinople. The modern notion of an autocephalous church coinciding with the nation-state, something which the Serbian Bulgarian churches had lost during the Ottoman period, developed now as ethnic states won their independence from the Ottoman Turks in the 19th century. Greece was the first in 1821, followed by Serbia, Romania, and Bulgaria. In all of these cases, the churches themselves, backed by their governments, unilaterally declared autocephaly, which the Ecumenical Patriarch initially refused to recognize. In the case of the Bulgarian Church, it took 75 years before Constantinople formally recognized its autocephaly in 1945. By contrast, Constantinople has been far quicker to recognize autocephaly or to grant autonomy to churches previously belonging to other patriarchates, such as Finland's break with the Patriarchate of Moscow after the Bolshevik Revolution. Since there is another speaker scheduled who's in the Orthodox Church of America, I will not go into detail regarding its situation. I will, however, raise a couple of issues. On the one hand, the Ecumenical Patriarchate claims that the Church of Russia, the OCA's mother church, has no authority to grant autocephaly, but that such autocephaly must be granted or confirmed by the Ecumenical Patriarchate itself or by an ecumenical synod. Yet, the canonical record and early history of the Church provide little basis for this claim. In fact, the 12th century canonist Theodore Balsamon, exilic patriarch of Antioch, recognized decrees of ecumenical synods, imperial edicts, and the unilateral action of the Mother Church as equally valid paths to autocephaly. The medieval and modern grants of autocephaly, in reality, an ex post facto recognition of de facto situation, by Constantinople have all been of churches directly under Constantinople's authority. On the other hand, the Russian Church's unilateral action in granting autocephaly to a church in a region with multiple jurisdictions may only have exacerbated what is already an uncanonical situation. Calls by certain Greek Orthodox in the U.S. for yet another autocephalous church would only worsen the problem. In conclusion, then, I believe that we may detect in the diversity of historical situations and canonical legislation a few general principles. First, the Christian Church recognized the local or regional self-governing church to be the ecclesiological norm. In both its canonical legislation and its early history, we have seen that the Church clearly opposed the notion of patriarchs or other powerful bishops exercising authority over an extremely large area or remote region. Even in those cases, such as Canon 28 of the Fourth Ecumenical Council, where the authority and jurisdiction of a see were increased, specific limitations were placed on the expanded powers. This is important in evaluating the validity of arguments for universal jurisdiction by the Ecumenical Patriarchate over all territories outside the ancient Roman Empire of the East or the traditional Slavic homelands. Secondly, the conversion of peoples outside the traditional boundaries of the empire challenged the Church to create new relationships between these daughter churches and the historic mother churches, which had given spiritual birth to them. The new relationship was what we now call an autonomous church, virtually self-governing, but still retaining some limited connection to the mother church. That principle has been inconsistently applied to modern Orthodox churches, so that small churches such as Finland with 52,000 or Japan with 25,000 are autonomous, while the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America, which formerly functioned as a de facto autonomous church, has come increasingly under the direct control of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. Thirdly, until the boundaries of autocephalous churches, until the 19th century, while diocesan boundaries generally followed provincial ones, the boundaries of autocephalous churches historically were were not necessarily identical with modern nation-state boundaries. In fact, the concept of the nation-state itself is a modern idea. Although these autocephalous boundaries have frequently coincided with either a multi-ethnic empire or a nation, quote-unquote, understood in the more classical notion of an ethnic group with a shared linguistic and cultural heritage. This may partly explain the inconsistency I noted just a minute ago, since Finns and Japanese are considered ethnically distinct from their Greek and Russian spiritual parents, while the Orthodox in this country are often referred to as a diaspora by their mother churches. An obvious exception is the Church of Crete, with a semi-autonomous status which includes the internal election of its bishops. Finally, as a summation of the previous observations, there appears to be no easy answer to the question of who may or may not proclaim autonomy or autocephaly, and under what conditions. The historical record shows that individual mother churches have sometimes done it, and in a couple of instances, so did an ecumenical council or an emperor. The churches granted autocephaly or autonomy have ranged from, on the one hand, apostolic churches associated with the state and ethnically identical to other autocephalous churches, to, on the other hand, ethnically distinct churches, which constitute a small minority within their general population. In virtually all instances of autocephaly or autonomy granted over the past 2 centuries, the power of the state was instrumental either in forcing the mother church to cut the apron strings, as with Soviet pressure on the Moscow Patriarchate to grant autocephaly to the OCA, or in protecting and even promoting a newly autocephalous church until such time as the mother church was prepared to recognize officially the de facto situation, as with the Balkan churches. In either case, the separation of church and state in the U.S. is likely, ironically, to make autocephaly or autonomy more difficult to achieve than has normally been the case. Thank you.
At this time, as I had said earlier, we would like to entertain some questions and discussions from the floor for about 10 minutes because Ms. Karras has to leave. Thank you.
Laura?
Yes.
Laura, you have to wait for the microphone. Okay, sorry. You can stay.
I just want to clarify your mention of 2 autocephalous churches in the United States. Do you understand OCL's resolution for a unified?
Oh no, not OCLs, but I have read on Boethia and heard others speak of the Greek archdiocese in this country becoming autocephalous.
Okay.
Without any record, have specifically said, well, they don't think that the Greeks would be ready yet to join with the others. Well, that is simply a kind of ethnic philitism.
Muhammad II installed the monk Ignatius, who was George Valerius, on the patriarchal throne, and he is the precursor of the current patriarch. What significance can we attach to what we are trying to do today when we are just following on such a bold step that was taken by the Ottoman ruler at that time? Would you comment on that, please?
Yeah, well, I think that what Mohammed or Mehmed II did was basically in line. I think he was taking his cue, actually, from what the Byzantine emperors had done in many cases previously. And that's why I made the comment that I did at the very end of my paper. Orthodoxy, since the time of Constantine, has based its ecclesiology on some notion of a relationship with the state, of that head being Orthodox himself. Under the Ottoman Empire, that was not the case, and yet because that paradigm was already established, the church continued to operate under that same model. What we have in this country is a legal separation of church and state, which actually makes the situation more complicated. And this has been seen in the case of the Russian metropolitan in the early part of this century, and in the Serbian court case about 20 years ago, where the American courts have refused to rule on anything in terms of granting any kind of specific legal recognition to autocephaly proclaimed on this side, because they consider that to be an internal church matter, and they're not going to get involved. So the separation and the non-involvement actually actually tend to work against churches in this country rather than for it, I believe.
Well, it's interesting that in your speech at the GO meeting, you made a very profound speech that the laity is the state in America. And in this speech, you're saying historically there's precedent for the emperor to grant autocephaly. So, in a sense, there could be a case made that the laity itself could proclaim autocephaly.
I think that ecclesiologically, theologically, you can make that type of argument. What I'm saying is that in terms of the courts, they're not going to get involved in that kind of an argument as to who has that right. Do you see the distinction I'm making is
But
that
you could make a legal case.
they've turned it down already in a couple of instances. In the case of the Russian church, it was preserved from being taken over by the living church because most of the properties were considered to be legally owned by the bishops and metropolitans of the dioceses in this country, and they actually collaborated with the parishes to turn over ownership so that the living church in Russia could not acquire ownership of those properties. But a few of those instances are actually still in court, believe it or not. And in the case of the Serbian church, you had a situation which was in some ways remarkably similar to what has happened over the past 2 years in the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese. The Serbian Patriarchate under communism about 20 years ago deposed the archbishop who they had, split their archdiocese into two smaller dioceses or archdioceses and put in new bishops. The majority of the Serbs in this country did not recognize this. They continued to recognize the deposed archbishop as their legitimate archbishop. And as I mentioned before, the Supreme Court refused to hear the case.
Valerie, if I may, you just briefly mentioned philitism. I'm not sure people know what that means and how it's been condemned by the church, and I think it's important in terms of our context for people to understand exactly what that means. So would you expound a bit on that?
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, philitism is considered to be a kind of racism, basically, to make one's ethnic identity a priority. And it was condemned by the Ecumenical Patriarchate in 1872. Now, what is ironic about this is that the Patriarchate was acting in response to the Bulgarian church's autocephaly. They were decrying it because they considered that to be an act of philitism, that the Bulgarian Patriarchate, the autocephaly of the Bulgarian church, was based on its national identity, its ethnic identity. Obviously, the current Patriarchate has a different view with respect to the alliance which it believes needs to remain between itself and Greeks in what it calls the diaspora.
My name is Danny Karcazes. I can assure you my questions, my thoughts, which is to a lot of people, but I never said it. I will say it for the first time. Been involved with our churches since 6 years old. And be part of building churches, Chicago, 3-4 of them, and specifically the circuit school, which I personally built in the finances. I have one important question. America is built on specialty in business, education, politics, and otherwise. The hospitals employ doctors for the medicine. The universities employ professors for teaching, and so on down the line. My question is this. Why, thanks God, not all, some priests in America, they get involved with the business of the communities when actually they are here to preach and teach the Bible. And they, if they're educated at the Archdiocese or whatever over there, they should stay on their line. How can a priest or tell a businessman how to run the business department of a community when he knows nothing about the business? Number two, how can he tell a man he gives his money to the community how to spend it? So my point is this, and I hope I'm not out of order. What can we do with this important body to influence the archdiocese to slowly and nicely tell our priests, hey, you are the employer of the community and the preacher of God. The rest, leave it to us. Thank you.
That wasn't a question, it was a speech.
I think the Uniform Parish Regulations actually already set out a very good model where the priest is the head of the parish and the priest and the parish council are supposed to work together to take care of the affairs of the community. That's the same kind of model of symphonia that you see the church having had historically, even throughout the Byzantine period. I don't expect that the Archdiocese is going to push the priests into a limited role, and I don't know that we want to specifically delineate how limited or how broad the parish council's role should be either. I take issue with descriptions of a priest as an employee of the parish. The priest is not the employee of the parish. The priest is the pastor of the parish and has a very important job to do. But you're absolutely right. I have seen some priests who really would like parish councils to be nothing more than advisory bodies and have actually pushed for changes in the Uniform Parish Regulations to that effect. That would be very dangerous. I think that the system that we currently have not only is based on an Orthodox ecclesiological model of conciliarity, but also, because of the shared responsibility, provides an important balance in authority and power and responsibility.
Thank you very much, Valerie. She really has to go, unless you can make it real quick.
Valerie, do you have any perception of any type of methodology of which we can achieve autocephaly?
30 seconds.
That's the real question.
Obviously, the Mother Church could recognize autocephaly, or the same kind of model which was practiced in the 19th century could be practiced here, although the problem, as I mentioned before, is that the state is not likely to support it. In other words, autocephaly is simply declared unilaterally on this side without being recognized by the ecumenical patriarchate, in which case the church here would have to have enough legal protection in terms of its properties and whatnot to last out court battles, which would be likely to last over several decades. I don't know what else to tell you. Or the Great and Holy Synod, which is supposed to be convened sometime, in which they've been talking about for 37 years now.
Thank you very much, Valerie.